There comes a time in life when you have to admit sometimes, I really need to do a long patrol. And in this case, there are 3 reasons for doing this long patrol. For starters, to get Carl's surname spelled correctly. That's a good reason. Secondly, because I talked about my book a lot. And I do like talking about my book. It's new and in shops now. Advertisement over. But I also mentioned that I was going to talk about my next project. And I forgot to mention it at the end because I was hungry and going off hunting of food. And for anyone's information who wants to know, I did find food. It involved Pop-Tarts, but it was food. They were very nice Pop-Tarts. And third reason, I didn't have any slides in here about beacons, and that was because longer term I'm planning on doing a whole thing about beacons and development of navigational aids. But afterwards, when I was flicking through it at about, let's say early hours of this morning, I was going, that needs to be corrected. So I'm doing a long patrol. Whee! We can all enjoy. And today, of course, is the 17th December, so it's the Friday afterwards. And this will go up on the 18th of December. So this will go up tomorrow. Sometimes. But anyway, this is about how was British Night Fighting Doctrine developed for and then practiced during World War II. The Long Patrol. So, I'm fairly certain, and I could be wrong on this one, but I'm fairly certain that Australopithecus afarensis practiced night fighting. I haven't done extensive study. I am not an archaeologist, but I'm fairly certain as long as there has been, in fact, most animals do in practice night fighting, pretty much every species that's ever evolved on the Earth, whichever practices some form of violence, kind of gets the idea that doing it at night is an advantage. Because, as a rule, you can get closer. As a rule, whilst one of our best senses is hearing, it's sometimes not the best in terms of directional. And it's not good at giving you necessarily range. It might give you bearing, but that's boom, over that way. Not there, that far away. And that's what we rely on our sight for. It's kind of like smell. Smell is a general warning. I always remember at my school, on secondary school, there was a particular year 11 who liked to wear very, very strong aftershave. And a particular brand of aftershave. And it frankly stank. But he also fancied himself a bit of a bully. The one problem he had was that the amount of aftershave he put on, which he was sure would, well, it was aftershave deodorant thing. He was sure it would attract members of the opposite gender. I'm fairly sure it was in sufficient quantities to put them to gas them out. But we'll leave that to one side. It was strong enough smelling that if you were paying attention to your surroundings, even if you were outside, you could tend to tell where he was nearby, and if you fancied making yourself sparse and disappear, or if you were one of the few year 7s who he decided he really didn't want to fight because you looked kind of insane and talked about biting him, psychological warfare is an old skill. It's kind of like night fighting. He would, leave you alone as long as you made sure that you looked busy. So he could pretend that you weren't ignoring him, but he was ignoring you. Fun times. Anyway, night fighting has been around a long time. Because smell? But believe it or not, people wearing that much lynx is something which is fairly new. And then hearing, I've heard a sound. I can't see what it is. It could be a squirrel. It could be a bird. It could be a fox. They're always on the prowl at night. There are lots of reasons you could hear a random noise in the dark at night. In fact, if you think about it, of your senses, the only one you probably implicitly trust, and so the one that probably lies to you more often than not, is your eyesight. You know, how often is the phrase used? 20/20 vision. I saw it with my own eyes. I saw it in front of me. It's the certainty, in a sense. It's the sense which is the certainty. Taste is also certainty, but that's a little bit too late to act as a warning. And frankly, sometimes even when we do taste it and it's funny, we go, I'm still going to eat this because I paid a lot of money for it. Which is not sensible, by the way. If it tastes awful and you think it's burning a hole literally to your gut and out again, don't finish it. Put it to one side. Ask for something else. It's not being a weakling or a coward. It's being sensible. So, this is the joy we are talking about. This is what we are dealing with. Night fighting, when the sense we rely on most for our range, depth perception, for our find and fix, is at its least effective. And actually, it's even worse at dusk and dawn, when there is a difference between light and dark and there's that fuzzy bit. And if you ever stare out then, that's when you used to get taught things like if you hang around Navy too much, you get taught to scan with the sides of your eyes, not the centers of your eyes, because the sides of your eyes are far more focused on picking up movement. The centers of your eyes are far more focused on distinguishing shapes and colors to an extent. So, sides of your eyes are good for scanning to pick up movement. And you learn to scan with the sides of your eyes. It's a whole skill set. And lookouts are still a factor even as part of modern navies, because whilst we might have all these modern pieces of equipment, the Mark 1 eyeball is still pretty darn reliable and still pretty useful. And sometimes picks up things that the equipment doesn't. And even the people staring at the equipment don't. Now, pre-World War I, night fighting, when it does take place, therefore, tends to take place at knife fighting ranges. I used the example that you would on night fighting, this is the moonlit battle of Cape St. Vincent from 1780, and it's artificially had light added and all sorts of things for the painting, so you can actually distinguish the ships. But the ships are described as getting within sparring distance of each other, and in some accounts. And that literally means that the spars on the mast are hitting each other. That's how close they are getting. We're not talking the ships are a cable length or a few meters away from each other. We're talking they are getting close enough to each other that the rigging is meshing. The thing is, it's really the late 19th century that a lot of the optical systems that starts to develop, that eventually become the low light systems and the long range position systems, starts to come about. But it takes them a while before they become any good at actually doing stuff in the daytime. Well, in the nighttime. In the daytime, they're okay. In the daytime, they start to improve. But at nighttime, the ranges are still nastily close. The ranges are still right bang on top of each other. And this is the reality that we have to think about. This is the fear factor. This is why the Russian fleet is so scared when they're on their way around the world and eventually will get defeated at Battle of Tsushima on the Russian fleet at Port Arthur. Are so scared at night of torpedo boats. Why are they not firing on fishing boats? Because at night you can't see the enemy coming. And probably by the time you open fire, it's too late. Even if you illuminate the sky with star shell, if you're the big target and they're light craft coming in, they've probably already sighted you and got their torpedoes armed. Which means that the night is also a form of psychological warfare. You do one operation at night on your opponent, you're going to make them worry. You're going to make them untrustworthy of any night. Because they're going to start thinking about what could you be getting up to. Royal Navy in World War II, Taranto, and we'll be talking about this. They attacked Taranto at night. Now, we talk about the ships which are sunk and damaged and time it takes them to get back. What we often forget to discuss, and really don't mention as much, is the effect it has on Italian naval morale and the effect it has on Italian naval operations and crewing, and the effect it has on their AA gunners and all their personnel, and how many of them are getting sleep for the next few months, and how many of them no longer want to sleep on their ships when they're in harbour because, well, are they safe? And every time they hear a strange noise, is that a plane overhead? It has an impact. It's a very different impact than Pearl Harbor, because think about it, after Pearl Harbor, the Americans were very much never again will this happen, but the Mediterranean wasn't like that. The Mediterranean was a close quarters war, and the Italian Navy knew how close the Royal Navy were. They also knew the Royal Navy liked to operate at night. The Royal Navy liked the night. The night gave the Royal Navy advantages, which we'll get into. Jutland. Jutland is most famous, of course, for its surface action during the daylight hours. It's most famous for this battle which takes place. But really, it's the night action which defines the Royal Navy far more after World War I than the day action. The night action where the Germans get away. Or do they get away? Well, let's be honest, HMS Spitfire here returns with a whole length of Pommern on her. And, you know, coming home with some... Well, not Pommern. Spitfire returned with 20 feet of Nassau's armour on her. And having ripped a hole and, well, you know, been so close that Nassau couldn't actually fire her. That damage is not done by by the shells. That is done by the blast from the guns. Most of the damage on the upper decks. And I'm fairly sure that's also what happened to most of the crew aboard her on above deck. The German fleet gets away. But they lose Pommern, a pre-dreadnought. They get Nassau damaged. They lose. All the sorts of ships get damaged. A light cruiser gets sunk. And the Royal Navy loses ships as well. Night fighting for them is, they realise there's a risk. And there's a whole argument around the night battle at Jutland in that what would have happened if Jellicoe had engaged Shear's fleet. And the reality is that actually a night fight would probably have favoured Shear over Jellicoe. Because whilst Jellicoe's fleet had more training in night fighting than the Germans did. They also realised it's more difficult if you're the more numerous force at night than the smaller force, because for the smaller force, the odds are if you're firing at anything, it's probably an enemy, because they outnumber you. Whereas for the larger force, they have to check before they fire. And that hesitancy is what kills you, because at the ranges you're engaging, which are point blank range, close enough, they rammed Nassau, came home with 20 foot of armour plate off her hull. The guns couldn't depress far enough to fire at her. So it was the blast damage that did that. If you're at that closer range, that closer range, with battleship guns, it doesn't matter how much armour you have. There is no armour in the world which at that range is going to resist an 8-inch gun, a 6-inch gun, let alone a 15-inch gun, or a 12-inch gun, or even 11-inch, or 13.5-inch, whatever inch battleship gun you've got there is going to absolutely smatter you. And that is the reality of a night fight in World War One. If you have it at these close ranges, you are going to lose. But also, there's another lesson here. In that, if the British had been luckier about which destroyer flotillas were found, which ones the Germans came across, well, the Germans could have had a lot of problems. Because whilst Jutland is often treated as the source of the British obsession with night fighting, and it is to an extent, that is mainly the facade that covers the construction of night fighting and not a doctrine of night warfare, which the Royal Navy builds up in the interwar years. It's not the foundation for it. The foundation for it is the Royal Navy's most elite destroyer force in World War One, most elite small ship force in World War One. We are talking ships which are crewed by people who have no concept of, oh, you outnumber us, or oh, you're bigger than us, or oh, discretion is the better course of valor, isn't it? No. For them, they are to an extent, along with Spitfire here, the spiritual predecessors of the tribal class, and I do talk about them in my book in that way. But more importantly than that, for them, they are the embodiment of Jeremy Clarkson, the presenter of the Grand Tour and formerly of Top Gear, and a few interesting naval history documentaries. When he is shouting while driving a car, "Power!" Whenever you see that, that is what you need to have in your head when you think of the Harwich Force. They are a whole load of officers and crew trying to get as much power as they can out of engines, guns, and torpedoes. Everything. The maximum. No concept, no understanding of, do we think we might have too much? Have we gone too far this time? Did we risk too much? Those questions are not asked by the Harwich Force. They are commanded by Turret, who is one of the most aggressive Royal Navy officers the Royal Navy's ever had. And this is, remember, coming from someone who has written a book which has people like Sherbrooke and Vian and Jones in it. I always love Basil Jones's name because people hear it and go, Jones. Sounds like such a nice guy. Just read about the actions of 10th Flotilla, and then you go, they did that, and that, and then they did that, all in one night? Yeah. Well, Tourette's is like that. And this force is a Harwich force, for one thing, it goes up and down in its number of destroyers and its cruisers. At Jutland, they were packing with them, I think it was 6 light cruisers, 2 light cruisers as destroyer leaders, and 32 destroyers. And this is a force which has done a lot of night fighting. If any force has managed to reach a sort of level of, we are the elite night fighting force of the Royal Navy in World War One, by this point it's the Harwich force. They are scary. And again, there is a name which comes up again. 10th Destroyer Flotilla is one of their destroyer flotillas at the Battle of Jutland. 10th DF is a name which tends to turn up in Royal Navy history. So whenever they need to have a destroyer division or destroyer flotilla that's going to be particularly worrisome to most people, they pick from about 3 destroyer flotillas: 4th, 6th, and 10th. I have no idea why, but just look at the histories of those particular 3 flotillas, and they just seem to crop up doing nasty things to bad people, as defined by the Royal Navy. Anyway, the Harwich Force were created as this first phase of defence for the Channel. You had the Channel Fleet or Dover Patrol, which really backed up the channel barrier, the great big minefield put across the channel to keep the Germans from going down there. And that force has pre-dreadnoughts. It tends to have HMS Dreadnought herself in it. It has the monitors. It has various cruisers and destroyers. It has its own force. It is a powerful force which is made to get, if you go through and try to go through the minefield, you're going to then have this lot. And everything's going to buy time for the Grand Fleet to come down behind you and absolutely swarm you. Well, so the Royal Navy are not the nation, not a navy which likes to leave these things to chance. And they look at this and go, that should buy enough time, but what happens if it doesn't? What happens if it doesn't buy enough time? We need something else. And so they set up the Harwich Force. And the Harwich Force gets the C-class cruisers. The Harwich Force gets the biggest, most powerful destroyers. The World War I L-class, the M-class. They are powerful ships. And their purpose is very simple. You will get past us, but if you get past us, every single one of us will no longer be afloat, and we will have taken a lot of you with us. Tritt is honest with his sailors. He is honest with his officers. They understand that is their role. Their role is to make the German, especially the German scouting force, pay for every mile of sea they have to cross between where they're coming from and the Channel barrier. They will have to pay a price. And it's almost an unacknowledged thing, but if you read the they have this idea. They don't expect other ships to stop and pick them up if they get sunk. They don't expect their friends to come and pick them up. They'll try and get in life rafts, and the whole point is if they're picked up after the battle, it'll be by ships of the Grand Fleet. Because if there's such a battle, they don't expect any of their ships to survive it. As elite as they are, if their Germans are still heading towards the Channel Barrier and they've run out of ammunition, they're not heading home, they're ramming you. The Germans were very, very lucky in that Jellicoe placed that force at the other end because he thought the Germans would go that side of him if they were trying to get to Germany. If it had been the homogeneous organized force of the Harwich force, the Harwich force had been the force on the side where they went through at Jutland, night action Jutland. Considering their philosophy, their experience, their training, the Germans could have lost a lot more ships because at night the light ships, with their maneuverability, their speed, owned the darkness. And would the Royal Navy have been happy losing such ships? Probably not. Would they have been happy to, or rather, would they have accepted exchanging those ships for several of the German dreadnoughts put at the bottom of the ocean thanks to the torpedo attack? They could probably have lived with themselves. It wouldn't have been a price they'd wanted to pay, but it would have changed the historical perception of Jutland completely. Because it would turn Jutland into a free-stage battle, as everyone understands. Instead of what everyone tends to think of as the run to the south, the run to the north, the engagement, and then when actually they would do the run to the south, the run to the north, the engagement, and then the night action. It could also change the lessons which get taught into World War II. It could change the entirety of history. It's an interesting point to go through. But the thing is, the service which realizes this most is the Royal Navy. They realize this. They've used motor torpedo boats during the darkness. They've got admirals who really do support it. They've got Keyes, who was in charge of the submarines and the motor torpedo boats at Harwich. Tritt, who of course was in charge of the Harwich force. And Jellicoe, who had been keen on night operations and able to fight at night prior to World War I, when he was first Third Sea Lord, he'd argued for it, and Second Sea Lord. He talked about that need for training. But he gets into it more. He talks about, all these three officers are talking about night actions as an inevitability, as something which the Royal Navy is going to have to fight, and as something which allows smaller forces to take on larger forces with an advantage. Their perception is largely that if the Germans had actually attacked the British during the night, the Germans could have scored a victory. There's also an understanding, especially between these two, but also to an extent of Keyes, that if it had been the Harwich force, which the Germans had found there, rather not a British battle squadron, the Harwich force, then it could also have been turned the other way around. It could have been a historic defeat for the German Navy. Because again, these ships led by Tritt would have done what they had to do to stop them getting past. The thing is, it might have then changed the war because he might not have survived. And a lot of his officers in the Harwich force might not have survived. Because again, HMS Spitfire limps home. That's nothing wrong with her crew. Her crew, she gets home at 6 knots. She's got home. and it's not protecting the channel, so they might well have used the darkness to limp home as well. But they also might not have, because they are a very revved up, very motivated force who are absolutely based on the German fleet is the greatest threat to Britain we currently are facing. And this is the force which is basic primary roles are keep the Germans away from the Thames estuary and keep the Germans away from the Channel. So he has the luxury of distance. He has the luxury of being a submariner. He has none of those luxuries and is sitting in small ships, facing off against the Germans, leading men who face off against the Germans, and there is no distance. The war is up close and personal from day one for them. The Royal Navy leaves World War One. They have these admirals who are pushing for night fighting, but also the first thing they're worried about is how do we maintain institutional memory? Yes, things like the Guides Acts are going to fall, and the wonderful Captain Kennedy of Rawalpindi, people like him, will end up leaving the Royal Navy. So that's going to be a loss of institutional memory. But you get rid of those senior officers, you retire them, it saves you money. It also allows you to keep promotions going of the junior officers coming up. So you can keep promoting those younger officers so you don't lose them as well. You might lose some of your best at the present, but you keep your very best, hopefully. And you allow for the growth and maturing of your very best of the future. You give yourself a promotional capability. The Harwich Force have been focused around having young officers. But how to judge and promote officers in peacetime? Well, the Royal Navy turns to the fleet exercises. They've always had a strong exercise philosophy, and they really do start to practice the idea of well, may your drills be bloodless battles and your battles bloody drills. Sorry, YouTube. But that old sort of philosophy, the idea of you train as you're going to fight, you fight as you train. And you train the fleet to do everything. And this becomes a heavy doctrine to bear. But it also is a risky doctrine to use. If you're training a fleet to fight at night, you have to accept there are going to be risks. You have to accept there are going to be losses. And that's quite a scary thing for any organization to admit, especially a naturally conservative organization like most militaries are. They have a thread of conservatives in them, not big C, small c. The idea of, especially when they're facing off against politicians and treasury, and how did this ship get damaged? Well, we were in an exercise, and bashed into another ship. So you guys were being stupid. No, we were exercising as if we were fighting a war. But we're not at war, and you're wasting this money. You can hear the conversations the admirals are having to have with the treasury officials and the politicians. And yet they keep doing it. They're having to have those conversations. Successive generations of admiralty officers are having to have those conversations, and they keep on doing it. And they even refine night fighting instructions. This is from the fleet standing orders. In the event of night action, if contact between capital ships has not been made during the day, or if the day action has been indecisive, the Admiral will decide whether or not to seek a night action between capital ships. In making the decision, the main factors to be considered are danger of losing touch with the enemy and being unable to bring him to action at daylight, geographical position of the forces, visibility and weather conditions, relative strength of the opposing light forces and their tactical position, enhanced fighting value of light craft at night as compared to that of capital ships, enhanced value at night of readiness and superior training and technique, increased liability of chance to influence event results. Possibility of surprise and the state of enemy morale as far as it's known or inferred. In the light forces, if the light forces are able to close the enemy battle fleet at dusk or located it after dark, they may be able to attack with great effect and produce opportunities for obtaining decisive results in a subsequent attack by capital ships. Early, well-organized night attack by light craft on the enemy battle fleet is therefore of paramount importance. 207. Whatever plan of action is decided upon by the Admiral, the light forces must be prepared to carry out the following duties during the dark hours. To attack the enemy, giving him no respite or time to reorganize. To keep the Admiral informed of the positions of the main enemy forces. To protect the main force from attacks by enemy light craft. Instructions for the rapid organization of the effective light forces for the performance of A must be included in the standing orders. This is something big. Admirals were criticized if they didn't get A of 207 sorted out early upon achieving command. They might just reiterate their reissue their predecessors, although, again, that could be frowned upon. It was a case of you didn't have to make changes, but you needed to show you actually considered it. Or they might add in changes. They might have, especially if you're a CNC of, let's say, the Mediterranean fleet, you might sit down with your rear admiral destroyers and go, right, let's work this out. What are we going to do? How will light forces be operating this operation if we are dealing with X fleet, the Italians, or Y fleet, the French? Because, again, we always worry about the French because the French are a bit strange. We love them. Well, we love their cheese and their wine. I don't drink their wine, but I know lots of people who do. But we often have a laissez-faire attitude to the French politics. Sometimes. Leaving that to one side, though, they are worried about these operations. They're worried about what they could need to do. And they're thinking about night fighting. And this is the point. At every level, the Royal Navy is having to think about night fighting because these are part of the standing instructions. So you have to think about them because you're going to be asked about them. And that's a good thing, because even if you don't have a solution, if you're thinking about the problem, you start to think about solutions. And you start to think about what it's going to do and what the competency levels are going to be. And if you're light forces, if you're a destroyer flotilla commander or in charge of light cruisers, you know it's on you. You know you're going to have to be doing it. And you get judged on it and tested on it in exercises. Your performance gets rated on it. And you start to practice these things. I'm not talking once a year. Oh, let's have a night exercise. I'm talking flotillas were training in this weekly. They were doing night training. How to run at night. How to coordinate at night. How to go into a fighting position at night. If we look at World War II, we start talking about the Royal Navy starts off with their destroyers operating in line astern. That's the standard doctrine for night fighting. Very quickly, there are some battles where apparently they try line abreast, but it's very difficult to maintain in dark. In fact, the only squadrons which even sort of seem to get anywhere close to obtaining it are the very elite tribal crews and some of the L class. Moment PPI, plot position indicator, a form of radar comes in which allows you to see on a screen where you are in relation to other blips. You have destroyer flotillas, especially the 10th, which is the tribal destroyer flotilla that adopt it first, and then it spreads around the rest of the fleet, go, we can make line abreast work because we can now, without lights on, using our radars, measure our positions. And not even every ship has to have it. But we need to, has to have PPI. We just need to be able to do it. And that's the point. That allows them to position themselves in the darkness at night. You've got the box formation, which destroyers use, where they literally sit around the enemy and they attack in turn from all the different angles whilst maintaining contact with the enemy throughout the night to watch them. That's what the tribals do on Bismarck in World War II. That's how they stop Bismarck slipping away from the fleet. It can't slip away. It's got 5 destroyers sitting around it. Any angle it goes, hello, I have torpedoes. You came to see me? How kind. I've got a present for you. That's slightly hubristic of take on it, but that is what we're talking about. And of course, then it comes to aviation tactics. Well, aviation is a different thing because the Royal Navy starts to think about something specifically with aviation tactics. Because aviation, from its get-go, as far as the Royal Navy is concerned, is, how do I put this politely, is associated with light forces. It's the whole way through. They treat aviation as an extension of the destroyer principle. And so they start to consider what can they do at night, and they can do this long-range strike. And you're going to sit there and think, why would you be doing a long-range strike with aircraft at night? Well, it's simple, really. It's rather ingenious as well. If you're the Navy which has carriers, and most other people don't have carriers, and you launch a strike, and you know you're not over your fleet, then any ships you're over must be the enemy's. Makes identification of friend or foe brilliantly simple. However, small problem. We now need a method of both telling the enemy, telling our ships, our aircraft that we are friends, and getting them back. We're going to need to figure this. There's also the problem that if you're navigating at night, well, even if you're navigating during daytime, if you go beyond visual range of your carrier and your task force, you're in trouble. You need to be able to read your chart, you need to be able to plot your position, and you need to be able to read a compass and put all these things together. Maybe take star shots if you're flying at night. And if you're flying an aircraft and trying to do all that, errors will creep in. And this is why single-seat aircraft are something which the Royal Navy tries to do. The Fairey Flycatcher and the Gloucester Nightjar, which is one of the first aircraft we see as a night fighter, are a single-seater. But as they start to think about longer and longer range operations, and they start to think about fighters potentially being used as reconnaissance aircraft as well, potentially doing some light bombing, potentially fighter bomber role, potentially escorting strikes. Well, especially as you're going through the late 1930s, you start to think of, let's have an observer aboard. Now, there's often some discussions about telegraphist air gunners and observers and the difference between them. Now, an observer is a trained navigator. A telegraphist air gunner isn't. But both can be trained to operate the system whereby they can receive the information from the beacon, which I'll be talking about in a bit, which can help you with getting back to your carrier and also identifying which fleet is your fleet, because your beacon is probably in the middle of your fleet if things are going right. It's got two advantages. But you have, if you could consider the full mark, the huge space at the back, the canopy area. People look at it and go, oh, that seems so strange. And you go, well, really? Imagine if you're trying to take a star shot. Got a lot of space to look out to take to look at the stars. If you're trying to navigate by that, if you are having your map out and are trying to position things, trying to work out where your position is so you can send a message back to your fleet. Found the enemy. They're here. Because there's no point sending a message, we found the enemy. Oh, goody. Where are you? Don't know. Not really any help, is it? You found them. You don't know where you are. You don't know where we are. And therefore, No one really knows anything at this point, other than you guys are probably going to get shot down shortly. Far more useful information is the enemy, and look, we've found the enemy fleet. They are here. Please send reinforcements. Can shadow fleet for X amount of time till we are bingo on fuel and have to return to carrier. Now, some of that data is probably inferred, but that's all there. That brings us to the beacon. So, started really with the Type 72X, which was fitted to a carrier in 1936. Now, there is debate as to which carrier received it first. There are three options: Furious, Courageous, or Ark Royal. There is a debate as to which of those three received it first. And the debate, I think, is likely around about the various systems going around, and no one's quite sure which one it was. Now, my personal bet, based on what I've read in both the archives and books, is Ark Royal. However, I have seen very good cases and arguments put forward for both Courageous and Furious, which are very logical. I would also add that whilst that I think it was far more quickly spread than is often officially stated. It's always usually read as, oh, there was one fitted for a while, and then suddenly they start fitting a lot more. But it's kind of like it officially starts developing in 1932, but by 1933 they're already ready for trials of aircraft. I mean, imagine that. A secure communication system, concept was thought up, developed, worked out how to be powered, how to be operated, and how to function, and its receiver as well as its transmitter, because the receivers need to be designed for aircraft, within less than a year to a level and manufactured, all designed and developed within less than a year and manufactured to a level at which you could test a functioning prototype. And then within less than 3 years, it's fitted to an actual carrier. I mean, it's amazing. Why we can't run projects like that today, I don't know. We just don't. But whatever happens, eventually the 72X evolves into the 72DM, which is the major type for the early phase of the war and is fitted to many ships. And in 1942, they started swapping this over for the 72DP. And if you are getting confused by the Royal Navy's choice of acronyms, I think you're supposed to. I think, honestly, they were just using the random acronym generator. And basically, its idea is this. You have a rotating aerial in that drum on top of the carriers. And it sends out a narrow beam. And it's synchronized, so it does one rotation every minute. And at the 0 of that minute, it's pointing dead ahead of the carrier. So you synchronize your watch, synchronized, with the watch which controls that. So that your second hand is synchronized with that. When you get within 50 miles of the carrier, you can pick this up. And if you look in your second hand on your watch, when you hear it at its strongest, because you'll hear it a bit before and then go, go dee boop, boom, dee boop, dee boop, boom. Something like that. That's once described to me. You look at your watch and you go, oh, it's that way. Because it's a reciprocal bearing. So you have to imagine your watch that way. If I hear it when it's pointing to 0 and I flip my watch up, then the carrier's that way from me. And as you get closer, you can refine your position and go, at the 0 time, it's pointing north. Okay, I should be trying to hear it when it's at the 32nd point. Bearing and just go around. It's not precise. It's not perfect. It's not wonderful. But it works. It's ruggedly reliable. And it's what makes night operations and night flying actually possible. Because it suddenly creates a basket for your aircraft carrier, which instead of at night is where we can see the ship, is 50 miles around it. And that means you can start putting up hooded lights. So the lights can only be seen if you're flying in from a few degrees off the stern. So they're all hooded. So instead of the ship being this big, glowing, lighted thing, it's a hooded. And it all is developed as part of this process. Okay. And as I've been over, destroyers have been part of this process from the beginning. At the beginning with the aircraft carrier, before you had the beacon, you had these little floats dropped into the water, which would be lights and would put a chain of lights leading up to the carrier. Because there was worry of the enemy following that to find the carrier, a destroyer would often be positioned along it to go, hello, you hunting our carrier? Oh goody, we have torpedoes as a present for you. Please, have some fish on us. Again, hubristic, but they realize it's a weakness. They try and turn it into a bit of a strength. They still keep doing those floats. They're even using them at Taranto and various other operations. They have the beacon, and then they have the floats. And the whole point is, you have them burning for a lot less time by the time you get to World War II than you had when they first began. So that it's not such a long line of floats going off in the darkness. But it allows your aircraft, when you have none of the modern landing aids you have, none of the, the angled mirrors, none of that system is available. They are there to try and give you some depth perception, some idea of how you're landing. And destroyers are critical for this. The destroyers are also focusing in on 3 things. What are their jobs at night? Their jobs at night are to kill their enemy. That's it. Take them out, damage them as much as they can. It's during this period that the Royal Navy starts to develop the idea of, well, we need to fix our target. Okay. Shall we use searchlights for it? Prefer not to, as that reveals our position, like what happened to the Germans at Jutland. Okay. How about Starshell? Ooh, Starshell's good. Starshell we'll go with. But Starshell's a bit of a waste. Is there any other way we could illuminate a target? Well, there's a system as would be definitely used by tribal class destroyers at several points in World War II and was developed prior to World War II for other destroyers as well, where you decide to illuminate your target by covering it in 4.7-inch shells. All the explosions and bangs going off, yes, it's 4.7-inch high explosive. Yes, it has no chance of penetrating a battleship or even a heavy cruiser's armor, or even a light cruiser's possibly in some cases. But it is going to, A, drive quite a lot of their crew off the exposed positions, B, damage radar, and C, create a nice, pretty firework display which will allow bigger ships to go target. And also allow other destroyers to go torpedoes, target. Now, the critical thing for this point is the gunnery. Because as much as some people will turn around to you and say, oh, we knew from the whole point in the interwar period it was the aircraft coming. No. Aircraft carriers are coming through. Yes, they're lovely. But aircraft and aircraft carriers, they don't replace the capital ship as the premier killing system, arguably ever. They just become the more practicable killing system, because they can engage at long range and they can come back and hit you again and again before you can ever get in range of them. And that's once aircraft reach that point. Until then, you have assassins like HMS Rodney and Nelson, who are designed around night fighting, arguably. This design really makes sense once you get into night fighting, because the whole point is they are supposed to get as close to you as they can, because that's how the Royal Navy fights at night, and then revealing the minimal amount of hull and shape they can, so you have the smallest possible target, but fire the largest amount of guns they can at you, i.e. 6 16-inch guns, 9 16-inch guns, and 6 6-inch guns at close range. This is not a ship you want to fight at night. Not in the 1920s, and certainly not in the most of the 1930s. Pre-radar, this is not a ship you want to engage. This is a ship you want to avoid. Avoid hard. Because the other point is, at night, you're probably not moving as fast. Now, I'm not saying our other Royal Navy battleships aren't going to be good and dangerous at night. They all are going to be good and dangerous at night, because they're all training for it. It's one of the things when we consider World War II. Admiral Lee actually has to think about his fleet, and does think about it and goes, actually, I'd rather not fight a night action because it's very risky, but more importantly, I'm not sure how my crews and they're trained up to it. Cunningham at Taranto has the entire battle fleet. Some of those ships had only just joined him. One of those ships hadn't even been his ship the previous morning. Has no qualms. They're all sitting outside Taranto, not far from the HMS Illustrious, where she's launching a strike from. If the Italians come out to fight, hello, we're here. And that is ultimately the point. Now, radar, when it first comes in, they have a debate on what they're going to do. You've got HMS Saltburn. This reminds me, it gets Type 79X in radar in October 1936. And the radar is literally the cables between the masts. That is its radar. And it's not massively long range. It's not massively capable, but it's a radar system, and it works. Now, very quickly, it's evolved into what is the Type 79Y, which is fitted onto HMS Sheffield in September 1938. The differences between them, well, the 79X had a frequency of 75 megahertz, or which translates to a wavelength of 4 meters, and could detect aircraft at an altitude of 500 feet at a range of 17 nautical miles. 79Y was 43 megahertz, or a 7 meter wavelength. And it required separate transmitting and receiving antennae, and its power output varied between 15 and 20 kilowatts, depending on variance and time. And it could, well, detect aircraft at roughly 53 nautical miles, 10,000 feet. What's the next ship that receives radar? The Nighttime Assassin, HMS Rodney. Hello. Yes, I'm now a new and improved and armed radar as of October 1938. Now, we can all question two things. One, why when they designed Rodney, they didn't include space for extra boilers to be subtly added? Oh, yes, we've had to, we've designed water into her hull for armor, but we haven't designed in more space for boilers. Or, you could have got away with it. And then in 1938, Japanese have left the treaty. Oh, sugar. Let's add about 4 more boilers to HMS Rodney. Why? The increased horsepower will probably get her to roughly 30 knots. Especially as we designed the turbines to use that extra boiler power if it was available. Give a radar. A very, very scary ship is born. I'm still not a big fan of the gunner regiment, but at night fighting it does really make sense. And then it's HMS Curlew, because the Type 79 moves from being a general purpose radar to being definitely an air defense radar. And she gets a Type 79Z. And eventually, this is what you're going to love, the version which is fitted to everyone. The version which is fitted to everyone is the Type 79B. Yeah. Just to make sense, they started off with the 79X, they went through the Z, and then eventually they fit everyone with the B. And that had a detection range of 90 nautical miles for aircraft at 20,000 feet. And it could track surface targets at ranges of between 2 and 6 nautical miles. Not that long a distance, let's be honest. But don't worry, if you need to surface track, well, we have another friend for you. It's called the Type 281. It's an air defense radar. It also has, with the precision gun ranging panel added in, the ability to be used for surface gunnery. And you can select all sorts of modes for it. It's quite an advanced system. Unfortunately, the first set is fitted to HMS Dido, which has interesting experiences with her radar. The second set is fitted to the Prince of Wales, which also has interesting issues with her radar throughout her career. And really, those don't give a good impression of the Type 281. But there is a reason why they come up with the Type 281B, which is the the standard radar theoretically, and then that becomes the Type 281 BP, and eventually the Type 281 BQ, which was the BP fitted with power rotation, which it could rotate 2 or 4 times per minute, and that tended to be the one which was equipped with a plan position indicator. Again, you will find a nice discussion of radars in this book. It's really wonderful from the destroyer perspective. And the plan position indicator is a pretty cool system for helping you work out where you are and where your targets are. This is what it looked like. Please note, that's a B aerial aboard HMS Swiftsure. What I always find funny is that the first ones that are issued of these they have a detection range of roughly 110 nautical miles. But the first ones to go out, they can turn, but they can only turn so many degrees before you have to reset them. And it's the same with the Type 279, Type 79, and the Type 279 as well. They all have sort of little flaws at the beginning. Which again makes the beacon quite so interesting in that radar, well, it starts off with the Air Ministry, and then the Navy tries to implement it, and it takes them years to turn radar from basically 1933. At various points, they're working on radar, and honestly, you can argue it's not really in proper service till 1941. 1942 is when it's really reaching a point at which the Royal Navy is not just fully embracing it, but is actually fully capable of using it, and the unit sets they've got available are actually up to the task. And this is not anything bad for the Royal Navy or anything. Pretty much everyone's in the same boat to a lesser or greater extent. And sometimes you go, well, this radar is very, very good that this certain nation produces because it does this, and that shows how much more advanced they are than the others, and that you can do that with any of these radars. But then you go, well, hang on, how many of those sets do they have, and how many of those sets do they have, and da 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 da. And each nation has a set which would be very good, which if you're picking one category as your top trumps will be amazing, and the others will not. And then if you pick a different category as your top trump, then it won't be that radar set, which is amazing. It'll be another radar set. It's developing technology, which is what makes the beacon, that speed of which ender serves, quite so amazing. And you're probably sitting there going, well, yeah, the beacons are very, very much easier technology, isn't it? It's just a thing going round. Yeah, that's easy. That's an easy bit of technology. There is perhaps, although you have to make sure it's synchronized and perfect time all the time, otherwise other things are gonna be off, and that's quite difficult, but not massively difficult. Chronometers have been around for a while at this point. But what you do have as an issue for the beacon is the receiver on the aircraft. That's complicated. That's not necessarily the easiest thing in the world to put together and to make it all work well. And remember, that's got to be, to an extent, as precise as well. It's not going to give you the direction. That's what the ping and your watch does. That's the advantage of the system, because is your watch on exactly the same time as the watches which the ship's set to? Is it to the second accurate? Because if it's not, you could be off in your bearing in your attack if you don't understand the system on your attack on the carrier. Whereas the receiver, that's got to listen for you. It's got to tell me it's got to be very, very good at detecting you. And it's that sort of system which makes Taranto possible. It makes the attack on Taranto actually possible. It's launched and recovered entirely in the dark based off this. Think about this. The Royal Navy launches a strike. 2 aircraft get shot down out of 21 which actually fly off. 1 has to turn around because it's damaged, it's got issues. But the remaining 18 all make it back to the carrier. Not a single aircraft is lost due to navigational error. Not a single aircraft is lost due to navigational error. That's amazing. This is November 1940. These pieces of equipment have been around less than half a decade. Most of them have only been implemented into the fleet less than 5 years. And thanks to the training they had from before that, they are able to implement an attack in the dark and not lose a single aircraft through navigational error. There are daylight operations in World War II implemented by other nations which don't achieve that level of success. There are many things which you can argue the setup of the Fleet Air Arm had caused issues of in the 1920s and 30s. And I would argue it causes a fundamental misunderstanding for the Royal Navy as to what is possible of aircraft, because there is such a large disconnect between them and the aero engineers. And it only starts to change once they start to really circumvent the Air Ministry to make sure they're getting the unfiltered information from the engineers. And that's not because the Air Ministry are bad, it's because the Air Ministry have preconceived perceptions over what you need for a naval aircraft, and that's not the reality of what the Navy needs for a naval aircraft. It's basically a classic scenario of the Admiralty talks one language, the Air Ministry talks another language, the Fleet Air Arm talks a third language, and the air engineers are talking a fourth language. And the translations having to go Air Arm to Fleet Admiralty to Air Ministry to engineers and then back. So it's got 6 layers of translation going backwards and forwards for a circuit, and that's what leads to so many of the issues. But one thing they do manage to do, let's be honest, one of the things that the Ministry and the Admiralty do not muck up with the control of the Fleet Air Arm and its dual structure, they produce damn good pilots and observers and telegraphist air gunners. They produce people who really can navigate at night. And remember, the observers are naval officers. They are 100% recruited, trained naval officers. The Royal Navy basically is saying, we need the best navigators we possibly can in order to do these night strikes. This is the service which regularly, if you read some of the popular history books, gets tarred with they didn't value air power, they didn't understand carriers, they didn't do this. Okay. They valued night strike capability and long-range carrier strike capability so much, they were literally selecting the best of the best navigators they produced and sending them to be trained as observers. So they would sit in the planes and navigate them to where they needed to hit their target. That does not sound like a Navy which doesn't value air power. Madapan. Of course, remember, they actually do use a searchlight in this, and there is an argument by some people that it's to give Prince Philip something to do. Well, it does allow him to write the foreword for this book. But I think actually the reason they're using the searchlight is because it adds impact. It blinds the enemy. You're engaging at incredibly close range. You want to not only overwhelm the enemy by blowing them up, you want to make sure you hit them immediately, you shock them, and they surrender. Or rather, they mentally surrender because there won't be enough ship of them left in that to actually physically surrender. That's what the searchlight is used for. Boom! On. As you can see, the superstructure, the bridge, everything, blinding bright light. Bam! It's psychological warfare. convoy battles throughout World War II were fought in the dark. U-boats famously like to use the dark. They used to like to use the dark in order to go into the middle of convoys and sail down them, attacking the enemy, attacking from within. Once the Royal Navy realized this, thanks to some very helpful Wrens, what did they do? They would stick a sloop or a corvette in the middle of the convoy. There is a small spike in submarine losses in about sort of late 1940, early 1941. And there was huge debates amongst the Germans as to what caused it. And for many years, there were many debates amongst historians as to what caused it. Well, the reason is quite simple. And it wasn't really publicized, it wasn't really discussed, because everyone who had been involved were keeping it quiet. It wasn't Enigma, it wasn't any technology, it was just wargaming had helped them figure out work out that this is what the Germans must be doing. But the trouble is, for the Germans, if you're in the middle of a convoy and you're on the surface and there's an escort in there because they know you're coming, you're done. Close range, at night, they have more guns than you. And you're in something which is designed to sink anyway. And if it gets damaged, you can't take it underwater because you won't get it up again. You're in the ultimate surface radar. The moment you get damaged, you are no longer of any value at all. Not even as a presence. This battle, of course, is the battle where Scharnhorst gets surrounded and annihilated at night. And again, Duke of York, like Fraser and Duke of York, just like Cunningham at Matapan, waits until he gets really close. He waits until he gets so close, he might as well be touching them. Why? Because it makes definite any kill. And because it gets within range of your low-level night visual systems. Because watching for splashes is very difficult at night. Far easier to be close enough that you can guarantee an impact. The Battle of the Shant. A death-defying and defying fight in the shallows. An absolute destruction of the German forces trying to interfere with D-Day. And for most of it, there is a reversal of what you think the scenario should be, because HMS Black Prince, she's blasting away with her 525s, firing star shell to make sure it is a full sky. A nice bright night. And also because by putting that light over and behind the Germans, where they think they are, when they're fixed by radar, it illuminates the Germans, and it makes it even darker and even harder to spot the Brits and the Canadians and the Polish, because they're all in darkness and it gets darker. If you ever actually look at the night, the most difficult area to fix on is the differences between day and night, when it's sort of dusk and dawn. When your eyes have to adapt from both light into dark. And this is why people always say it's darkest just before the dawn, and there's this thick dark patch, just a sort of line which you can see coming towards you or going away from it in dawn and dusk. And if you've got star shell going off behind you, so you imagine you've got almost sort of daylight around you, but that makes the area outside of that daylight patch even darker. And that's what tribals are hiding in. That's what they're attacking abreast, in line abreast. All firing their forward guns, all blasting away happily, using their radar to fix their positions and to fix yours. That's what they can do by 1944. That's a scary night attack. That's a very scary night attack. And there's a reason why the Germans don't get any further tonight. So, what's the summary? Where does all this come from? The Royal Navy starts off the interwar years with 3 challenges. One, the only constant they know is that war is always going to be coming at some point. They'd like to believe it isn't, but they know it's coming at some point. 2, they've just been through one of the bloodiest wars they've ever fought, and they have accrued a whole mass of experience that they need to retain. And 3, the most high-profile battle of that war is also the battle which is least likely to ever happen again. Because, thanks to the Treaty of Versailles, the German Navy is unlikely to build a high seas fleet. And the only scenario where you end up with a massive fleet battle like that is probably in the North Sea between Britain and Germany. If you think about a war between an Anglo-American war, you would have squadrons going everywhere, because could the Americans afford to abandon the Pacific coast and just put their ships on the Atlantic coast? Would that be sensible with the Royal Navy, with the China Squadron and various other squadrons? Especially when they do cruises around the world, they'd have battle cruises in the Pacific before you could say, wow. What would they do out there? Who knows? But you'd soon have to send your battle fleet out there, so you wouldn't have all your battle fleet in North Atlantic. And would the Royal Navy really want to send their entire battle fleet across the North Atlantic to fight the Americans? Possibly a significant squadron would end up in Canada, but would the entire battle fleet go? No, because what happens if the American battle fleet crosses over while you're over that side and starts attacking you? And it's going to be a task force war if that's right. What about Japan? It's the same scenario. Are you taking your entire battle fleet? Do you want to risk it with the other nations around the world? What about fighting France or fighting Italy? Again, it's task force scenario. But Jutland's the famous battle. But they know they need to justify night fighting. And they know night fighting is going to be part of it, because, again, the task force scenario, the Royal Navy starts to think, well, we might be the largest navy in the world. Even with treaty agreements with the Americans, we are going to be the largest actual navy in the world, because Congress is never going to fund them. Whereas the British government will fund us. And actually, we can use the treaty system to force them to fund us, because we can go, but this is what you signed a treaty allowing us to have. If you cut us, you're cutting us below the treaty level. You can't do that. At which point the British government go, Treasury go. So that's the other reality of the treaty system, let's be honest. You can argue that without the treaties, the British would have built more, but there's also a chance they would have built less, whereas with the treaties, they couldn't build anything below the treaty level. But the thing is, the Royal Navy has built this fleet, and they know they're going to be, wherever they're fighting, they might fight outnumbered. They might be outnumbered locally, which means they'll be the smaller force. Which the lesson of Harwich, the lesson of Jutland, is attack the enemy at night. Attack the enemy where they have to be careful about who they're firing upon, not when we have to be careful about who we're firing upon. And this is why the Royal Navy develops its night flying doctrine. It also affects the design of aircraft. It affects the design of all these things. You have two-seater aircraft. Why? Because you need to have the observer. You need to have the navigator in there. The observer, as they're called. They do navigation, but they call them observer. Because again, their first role is theoretically is to observe enemy ships from that aircraft and work out what the ships are. They're the specialists in spotting and recognizing enemy ships. And accurately telling the Royal Navy what they're seeing. That's how the Royal Navy justifies it. They need people who can actually tell them what those ships they're looking at are. Not people who just go, it's a big grey blob with guns on. That's lovely, but is it a big grey blob because it's big relative to you and actually it's a destroyer? Or is it a big grey blob because it is a big grey blob and actually a battleship? It's got lots of guns on it. That's not helping. It's got 2 stacks. That's good. Is it flying a flag? Yeah. It's red and white cross on a blue background. You have spotted the flagship, haven't you? Oh, yeah, it's our ship. Oh, great. I would love to say that isn't an actual example, but there's a guy called Wing Brown Cave. Wing Commander Cave Brown Cave, a Royal Air Force officer, who actually details that at one point, from memory, in one of the reports he writes in the Argo, because he actually supports the Royal Navy in providing the observers, because he just goes, yeah, so far our attempts to provide people has not been successful. They don't speak the same language or explain things in the same way. So that leads us to Operation C. What might have been? Well, now I will say what I think really would have happened. If I think, often when I've been asked about this, is if the Royal Navy is prepared to launch a strike, and I think Somerville would have launched a strike if the first reconnaissance aircraft found it, but the second reconnaissance aircraft took the wrong bearing, didn't find them, so they lost them, and that's a navigational error. It happens. Even one of the best navies at it in World War II still makes mistakes in 1942. Human error crops up to this day. But what do I think would have happened? I think, thanks to the design of the Japanese carriers, I think the odds are the group that's going to get spotted is the 2 carriers on their own. I think they get hit. And I think at that point, probably Somerville pulls back to maintain reconnaissance attitude. And I think Nagumo in the morning probably goes, sugar, I've lost 2 carriers. I'm getting out of here because I'm not supposed to lose any. However, there are other options. Somerville could decide to be very, very aggressive. He could decide to channel the Rear Admiral destroyers of the interwar years in the Mediterranean fleet's interwar years, i.e. a guy called Andrew Cunningham. He did a few things during World War II. He was quite successful. And go for a destroyer attack. Send his destroyers out long. Go, right then, I don't have submarines as a major threat. Go hunt. He could decide a night strike like that. The Japanese could have decided to send the destroyers to investigate where the attacks come from. They could decide to do a night strike operation themselves. And what I think is interesting here is it all depends on who ends up spotting who and who encounters who first and how they do it. Because the Japanese methodology for night is an ambush with long-range torpedoes to launch them at as far a range as they can and basically ripple ambush you with torpedoes. The Royal Navy's methodology is to get closer, to use, by this point, radar, but earlier on their visual aids, to get as close as they can before you realize they're there, and then launch a devastating close-range attack with guns, torpedoes, everything they've got, a la what they did at Cape Bon. if the Japanese spot the if it does develop into a destroyer, if it's a night strike that develops into a destroyer battle, if the Japanese spot the British first, they might with the long lances actually prove devastating. But if the British spot the Japanese first, especially thanks to their reconnaissance aircraft, which the air service radar might well spot them coming, might not, might do, it does give them an advantage there, then it could be devastating to the Japanese. I don't predict it to be a cakewalk, because these are the two best sides at night fighting, and arguably never at no point does equivalent forces and organization face each other in World War II. There are some interesting early on battles. Where some ships which have a very good reputation in the Royal Navy under their previous commission don't live up to that reputation in those battles, which does suggest there are weaknesses there. Again, if the Royal Navy, if the Japanese spot you first and manage to engage you at long range, they can win. They win. But in this scenario, you would have the Japanese investigating, whereas the Royal Navy hunting. The Japanese looking out for what might be there, the Royal Navy looking out for what they know is there. Which might well mean the Royal Navy spots them first. And that's where the potential for interesting results come in. So what do we have coming up? Well, on the 23rd December, we have Patreon 41, Wayne Borin's Strategic and Tactical Thinking on RN Submarines and RN Anti-Submarine Forces Between the Wars. And 21st December, we have the Challenger Expedition. Also, please do remember to vote if you haven't in the Tassafaronga vote on the Tassafaronga video on my channel, because that vote is going towards what will be on the 30th of December in the live. So for a moment, I think the one winning on the votes is Thrawn Heads Up the Thames. Thank you very much, everyone. I hope you've had a good year. I hope you're enjoying these videos as they run up to Christmas. And yeah, take care.